Okay, this is our look at the peripheral nervous system, which lies outside the central nervous system and is made up of the peripheral nerves and their ganglia, which are clusters of cell bodies outside the central nervous system, and sensory receptors and the efferent motor endings. Okay, so this is how we send commands from and pipe stimulus information into the central nervous system. You can see the structure of the peripheral nervous system here. The afferent division brings in both visceral and somatic sensory information, and the peripheral nervous system then pipes that into the CNS, while the outgoing or efferent division is broken into a somatic motor division that targets only skeletal muscle and an autonomic division that targets everything else and is broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Okay, so the red arrows are efferent function and the blue are afferent function. Okay, sensory receptors respond to environmental changes, and so they're designed to produce a response based on their modality, right? Are they responding to light? Are they responding to sound? Are they responding to um, some other physical stimulus or a chemical stimulus, okay, or an electrical stimulus? This activation generates graded potentials, and this can trigger a nerve impulse. The sensation is the awareness of the stimulus, and the perception is the assignment of meaning to that stimulus. Okay? So, sensation and perception are going to occur in the central nervous system. In stuff that we're consciously aware of, sensation and perception happen in the cerebral cortex. Okay? In stuff that we're unaware of, all right, sensation and perception are terms that don't really have an application because this is below our conscious awareness. Okay, so what we have in stimuli that are below our conscious awareness is a stimulus response that doesn't really rely on sensation and perception, since those are functions of the conscious mind. Okay, but it doesn't mean that those stimuli are not processed and dealt with. Stimulus receptors are based on what they're designed to pick up, where they're located in the body, and how complex they are. Mechanoreceptors respond to a mechanical force. Could be pressure, could be tension, could be vibration, touch, tickle. Okay. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature. Photoreceptors to light. Chemoreceptors to a ligand of some kind. Okay, some sort of molecule, compound. Okay, and nociceptors respond to stimuli that cause pain, which can come from any of these other receptor types if the stimulus lies outside their range. Okay. Exteroreceptors respond to stimuli on the outside of the body, and they are found in the skin for touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Special sense organs are also exteroreceptors, such as the eyes, the inner ear, and so on. Interoreceptors respond to stimuli that come from inside the body, so they're sensitive to chemical and physical and temperature changes and can cause discomfort in some cases, but most of this information is going to be relayed along the afferent visceral division, okay, where it's going to be dealt with mostly by the hypothalamus and brainstem if it needs to be. Okay, very little of this information is going to make it up to our conscious awareness. The thalamus will filter that stuff out. Proprioceptors respond to body position and stretch and skeletal muscles and inform the brain of our movements. And this is one of the most high-speed afferent signals. Okay, these are the 250 mile an hour axons that bring this information into the central nervous system all the time. Okay. Simple receptors are designed for general senses such as tactile sensations, touch, stretch, and so on. Temperature, pain, and muscle sense are also part of general senses. Okay, where are these located? In the skin, in the muscles, in the joints. Okay, um, these are modified dendritic endings of sensory neurons. All right, so they are part of a neuron. Special senses deal with hearing, equilibrium, smell, and taste, and we'll deal with those in another chapter. The simple receptors can either be non-encapsulated, which means they're free nerve endings, or encapsulated, which means they're covered in some sort of connective tissue or extracellular matrix. Okay. Free nerve endings are found in the epithelia and connective tissue. They're non-myelinated, small diameter group C fibers. Okay. And they respond to temperature and pain. Some respond to pressure-induced tissue movement. Okay, you can see examples of some of these different receptors here. Thermoreceptors have a response range between 10 and 40 degrees centigrade and are found in the superficial dermis, while heat receptors are between 32 and 48 centigrade and found in the deeper dermis. Outside those temperature ranges, the nociceptors activate in response to pain. Unencapsulated dendritic endings have a role in nociception, which is pain detection. Vanilloid receptors are ion channels that can be opened by heat or low pH or chemicals. They respond to pinching, chemicals from damaged tissue, capsaicin oil, which is the stuff that makes the burn in hot peppers. Light touch receptors, Merkel discs, and hair follicle receptors are also examples of these unencapsulated dendritic endings. Okay? Encapsulated dendritic endings, okay, have a connective tissue capsule around the nerve ending, and they're found in the skin and connective tissue. Tactile corpuscles are for discriminative touch, lamellar corpuscles for deep pressure and vibration, bulbous corpuscles for deep continuous pressure, muscle spindles for muscle stretch, tendon organs for stretching tendons, and joint receptors for joint position and movement. An important thing to discriminate between is the difference between sensation and perception. In sensation, we are aware of a change, but we don't have meaning assigned to it until we have perception, where we tie memory to the sensation, and then we're able to associate it with previous experiences that we've had. Okay? This is one of the reasons, for instance, that when people are born deaf and they get a cochlear implant, it's very difficult for them to learn how to hear because they've never previously experienced sound. Okay, so their first experience with sound is often painful and frightening. Okay, whereas for someone who's had their hearing and they've lost it, if they get a cochlear implant, it's often easier for them to learn how to hear again because they have memory of sound that can assign perception to those sensations. Okay? Integration occurs in two places in the central nervous system. For conscious stimuli, integration occurs in the cerebral cortex, and for stimuli that we're not consciously aware of, it occurs in the hypothalamus and the brainstem. The somatosensory system is part of a sensory system that serves the body wall and the limbs and gets input from exteroreceptors, proprioreceptors, and interoreceptors. The input is relayed toward the head, but it's processed along the way. The levels of neural integration include the receptor level, where sensory receptors are involved in the integration, the circuit level, which is the processing that occurs in the ascending pathway, and the perceptual level, that's the processing occurs in the cerebral cortex. Okay, so three ways that we can essentially combine these little bits of information into an idea of what's happening to us. Okay, at the receptor level, receptors are specific for their stimulus, which has to be applied in the field that they monitor. Transduction, which is the change of the stimulus into a graded potential, will occur somewhere in this pathway. These are called generator or receptor potentials. The graded potentials have to reach threshold to generate an action potential in the afferent neuron, or else you will not have an electrical signal. In the general sense receptors, the graded potential is called a generator potential, where the stimulus causes a generator potential in the afferent neuron, and that leads to an action potential. Whereas in the special senses, the stimulus produces a graded potential in the receptor called a receptor potential, which is going to determine the amount of neurotransmitter released, which will generate graded potentials on the sensory neuron. Okay, so you've got an extra step in the pathway here. Okay, adaptation is the change in sensitivity to the presence of a stimulus that's there all the time. Receptor membranes become less responsive over time if they adapt, and the potentials decline in frequency or they eventually stop. Phasic receptors signal the beginning or the end of the stimulus, and they're termed fast adapting. So they lose their kick quick. Okay. Examples include receptors for pressure, touch, and smell. Well, tonic receptors adapt either slowly or they don't adapt, and examples include nociceptors and proprioreceptors. Now, you might well wonder, well, why is that? Okay. Well, you don't ever want to become insensitive to pain. I know you might think you would, okay, but the reason we need the pain signal all the time is because it informs the body of damage, and that damage has to be dealt with. And that's an adaptive response. It's a response that is likely to improve our chances for survival. Okay, if we don't respond to pain, then the area that's affected is likely to accumulate damage to the point where it might become non-functional. An example is a disease known as Hansen's disease, in which the pain nerve endings are damaged because of the invasion of a particular bacteria called Mycobacterium leprae. And what happens as a result is that those areas of the body lose sensation, and as they acquire injury and get infected, they eventually become necrotic. And the reason for that is that you don't treat the injury because you're unaware of it, because you don't have the pain signal to tell you to treat it. Okay? And as you might suspect, the common name for Hansen's disease is leprosy. Okay? You don't want to lose your ability to respond to proprioception, because then you'd have a difficult time maintaining your balance. All right? So you need to be aware of all times of your position of your muscles and joints, your balance, okay, in order for you to interact in a meaningful way with your environment. Long-lasting or intense pain, called hyperalgesia, is the result of an amplification of a pain pathway that can be produced either from damage in the nervous system itself, okay, or from damage in the areas of the brain that process pain. Okay, phantom limb pain is pain that's felt in a missing limb. Okay, and obviously the pain's not coming from the limb; it's coming from the damaged nerve endings and the map of the body that the brain is still utilizing to assign perception. Okay, over time, these things, phantom limb pain can fade away. Chronic pain may or may not. Okay, NMDA receptors are the players here, and they allow the spinal cord to learn hyperalgesia so that the pain is magnified in these people. Hyper just means intense or above, and algesia is pain. That's why analgesia is the removal of pain. Analgesics are painkillers. Okay. Early pain management is critical to prevent this. Okay. There's phantom limb pain. We can use epidural anesthesia or TENS units to reduce phantom limb pain, and eventually the sensation will go away. This is an example of something called referred pain. Stimulation of visceral organ receptors can be felt as vague aching, gnawing, or burning. It's activated by tissue stretch, ischemia, chemicals, and muscle spasm. This referred pain is pain from one body region that's perceived in a different body region. Visceral and somatic pain fibers travel in the same nerves, and the brain assumes that the stimulus comes from the somatic region. Okay, the classic example is the pain of a heart attack that's felt as radiating down the left jaw, neck, shoulder, and arm. Okay, it's not actually coming from there, it's coming from the heart. But the brain cannot distinguish between the two, so the perception is that it's coming from that region. Okay, the pain of a kidney stone, which I've had personal experience with, is felt as an intense pressure pain and a sharp pain in the groin that radiates through the abdominal pelvic region and the inner thighs. Okay, the kidneys, which is where the pain is coming from, are actually at the level of the 11th and 12th rib at the posterior of the back. Okay, and so you'd think it would come from there, but it does not. Okay, the pain of an appendix is felt at McBurney's point, which is midway between the crest of the ilium and the navel. Okay, the appendix itself is actually tucked down under the cecum. Okay, but note where the pain is experienced. A nerve has an organization very similar to a muscle. Okay, it's a cord-like organ in the peripheral nervous system that contains bundles of myelinated and unmyelinated peripheral axons that are enfolded in connective tissue. Okay, the connective tissue that surrounds the individual nerve fibers is called endoneurium. Bundles of those fibers, called fascicles, are surrounded by perineurium, and the entire collection of fascicles is surrounded by epineurium. Okay, and these are all connective tissue sheaths that keep the nerve anchored in place and prevent it from buckling, twisting, or kinking. Okay, notice that there's usually a blood supply along with these nerve fibers. Okay? Most nerves are mixes of afferent and efferent fibers and somatic and autonomic fibers. The reason for this is that in the body, most of the nerves come from the 31 sets of spinal nerves that come out of either side of the spinal cord. And these spinal nerves are combinations of both afferent and efferent fibers, as well as autonomic and somatic fibers. What happens after those nerves leave the confines of the central nervous system, form spinal nerves, they, in several places in the body, anastomose and branch extensively. Okay, anastomosing is where two or more things come together to fuse and create fewer branches, whereas branching is where one thing splits into two or more. Okay, so the branching and anastomosing makes a nerve net, and then the nerves that come off of that can have any combination of these fiber types, and as a result can feed many different targets, either bringing in or sending out information. And the reason there's not crosstalk is because of the presence of the connective tissue that insulates the nerve fibers from each other. Okay, so they're classed according to the direction they transmit impulses. Mixed nerves have both afferent and efferent information, while sensory nerves are entirely afferent and motor nerves are entirely efferent. So motor nerves only have outgoing information, sensory only incoming. Now, where are most motor and sensory nerves found? They're in the cranial nerve set. Okay, the remainder in the body are primarily mixed nerves. So, in mixed nerves, you can have somatic afferents and efferents, or visceral afferents or efferents, or combinations of those. Okay, peripheral nerves are classed as either cranial or spinal nerves. There's 12 sets of cranial, and there's 31 sets of spinal. All the spinal nerves are mixed. The cranial nerves could either be motor or sensory or mixed. Ganglia are collections of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system that are associated with afferent nerve fibers, and so they contain the cell bodies of sensory neurons. They're found primarily in a structure called the dorsal root ganglia, which is found along the spinal cord below where the 12 cranial nerves end. Okay, and there are little swellings, which are where those nerve cell bodies are located, and then the afferent fibers are coming in from areas outside peripheral to those ganglia, bringing information into the central nervous system. The ganglia are associated with efferent nerve fibers, have autonomic motor neurons in them. Okay, so they're going to be in the efferent pathway there's a two neuron pathway in the autonomic nervous system that we'll learn about in the next chapter, and the ganglia that are part of that pathway lie outside the spinal cord and also outside the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, you can see here that in the peripheral nervous system, we have the ability to regrow the axon if it is clipped or crushed. And the reason that this is possible is because of the presence of the the myelin sheath, okay, and the neurolemma. Okay, what happens as a result of this is that growth factors are produced that promote, first of all, the Wallerian degeneration of everything distal to the cut or the crush. Okay, axons come in and clean out the distal end, and then the axon sprouts filaments from a regeneration tube that is basically a product of the Schwann cells, and eventually it can re-find its target and reinnervate it. Okay, now this doesn't happen in the central nervous system because there is no regeneration tube. In addition to the fact that astrocytes and other immune functions form scar tissue where the break is, and that keeps the axon from moving through the injury and finding its new target. Okay, so treatments for this include neutralizing growth inhibitors and blocking receptors for inhibitory proteins. Recently, a groundbreaking surgical procedure in which a nerve graft was utilized in combination with glial cells from the olfactory bulb was able to regenerate central nervous system neurons in the spinal cord, allowing an individual to get up out of a wheelchair that he'd been in for 4 years and walk and have sensation. Okay, so this was pretty revolutionary. It was a few years ago, and it happened over in the United Kingdom. It has yet to be repeated, and we do not know whether it will hold up long term. But the hope is that this can become a routine medical procedure. Okay, I'll see everybody in the next podcast.